Islamic Sicily, A History, Chapter 5, Intellectual Activity During the Muslim Period. Though Sicily was an outlying domain of the world of Islam and had a turbulent history under Muslim rule, there were several elements favoring the efflorescence of learning and letters there. Teachers in mosque schools in Sicily were exempt from participation in holy wars. Both the Aghlabid and the Kulbite ruling elite included persons who were not merely patrons of letters, but creative writers and savants in their own right. It was a haven of refuge for scholars persecuted in North Africa. Conversely, Sicilian scholars migrated during periods of turmoil to North Africa or Egypt, and traveled even further east in quest of knowledge or in the pilgrimage to Mecca. This coming and going of scholars kept Sicily in the mainstream of Islamic scholarship. In the 10th and 11th centuries, it specially benefited from the major intellectual currents which had developed in Kairouan. Mosques were often the centers of these intellectual activities, where grammar and lexicography were taught besides the religious sciences like fiqh, which means jurisprudence, hadith, which means prophetic traditions, and qira'at, which means recitation of the Quran. Poetic tradition was also continued and acclimatized in Sicily. Ali bin Hamza al-Basri, the famous philologist and rawi, which means narrator, of the great Arabic poet at al-Mutanabbi, migrated to Sicily and died there in 985 AD. Studies of al-Mutanabbi and commentaries of his works were written by Ibn al-Bir, who visited Sicily, as well as by Sicilians like Ibn Qata and Abu Ali al-Hussein bin Abdullah. Dear listeners, support me with Buy Me a Coffee or a Super Thanks. Among the early Quranic scholars was Muhammad bin Khurasan, whose father was a Mawla, which means client of the Aghlabids. He studied in Egypt and later with Ibn Muzaffar, presumably in Iraq. He returned to Sicily and died there in 996 AD. Another Sicilian authority on Quranic recitation was Ismail bin Khalaf, who had studied in Egypt and on his return taught in Sicily. Owing to political upheavals on the island, he migrated first to Spain, then to Egypt, where he died in 1063 AD. Manuscripts of his famous work, Kitab al-Unwan fil Qira'at, are available in Berlin, Istanbul, and at Bankipur. Another of his works was a treatise on the diacritics of the Quran text. One of the early scholars of Hadith, Abul Abbas, whom tradition counts among the teachers of the traditionist Abu Dawud and the historian Tabari, is regarded by some, probably apocryphally, as of Calabrian origin. A Sicilian Hadith scholar of early 10th century was Abu Bakr Muhammad bin Ibrahim at-Tamimi, who went in search of knowledge as far as Iraq, where he is reported to have attended the Sufi halqa, which means circle, founded by the great mystique Junaid. He eventually returned to Sicily. There are several other scholars whose names alone have survived. These include Ibn Farah, Musa bin Hassan, who migrated to Egypt, Abd-Rahman bin Muhammad Bakr, who also had a proclivity towards Sufism and who traveled through North Africa, Egypt, and the Hijaz, Hassan bin Ali, who died in Mecca in 1001 AD, and Abul Qasim, who died in 1035 AD. Among minor Sicilian traditionists were Abu Masud Sulaiman, who settled down in Baghdad, and Abul Fadl Abbas bin Amr, who migrated to and taught in Spain. The Kulbite Abu Muhammad Amr, who was a renowned scholar of Hadith. Asad bin al-Furad, with whom the Arab occupation of Sicily begins, was primarily a scholar of fiqh, and indeed one of the foremost jurists of Islam's first 3 centuries. His family, which belonged to the Arab tribe of Banu Sulaim, had settled in Nishapur. Asad himself was born in 759 at Haran in Iraq. His father brought him to Kairouan when he was 2 years old. Asad studied the Quran in North Africa, but early in his youth went to Medina, where, according to a tradition, he studied under no less an authority than Malik bin Anas, the source of the Maliki school of law. At any rate, he studied Maliki law under Abul Hasan al-Absi, who died in 800 AD. In Kufa, he met and probably studied under some of the famous disciples of Abu Hanifa, the fountainhead of the Hanafi school of law. In Egypt, he further studied Maliki law under one of its eminent doctors, Ibn al-Qasim. He returned to Kairouan in 797 AD, and there compiled his famous work, the Asadiyya, which is not a commentary on Maliki's Al-Muwatta, but rather a compendium of the juristic opinions of Ibn al-Qasim. The influence of Kharijite Ibadi movement on his spiritual formation has also been suggested. In 818 AD, he was appointed the Qadi of Kairouan, a post which he held concurrently with Abu Muhriz Muhammad. Asad popularized some aspects of Hanafi teaching in North Africa, and his juristic position seems to be one of eclecticism between the Maliki and the Hanafi schools. It has also been asserted that the great North African jurist Sahnun was one of his disciples, though in his later work he disagreed with Abbas. Several works on Maliki law were written in Aghlabid, Sicily. One such work was by Yahya bin Umar, who died in 903 AD, and this was as popular in Sicily as it was in North Africa. Another eminent Sicilian jurist was Mamun bin Amr, who died in 928 AD, a disciple of Sahnun, whose other disciple, Diana bin Muhammad, who died in 909 AD, was one of the chief qadis of Sicily under the Aghlabids. A Persian jurist, Abu Ja'far Marwazi, made his way to Sicily in 905 AD, but was strongly suspected of heresy. Because of the close religious and intellectual relationship between North Africa and Sicily, scholars of one land held positions and offices in the other and vice versa. Thus Luqman bin Yusuf, who died in 930 AD, an eminent scholar of Maliki law, had stayed and served for 14 years in Sicily. The dates of another Sicilian jurist, Abu Muhammad Hassan bin Ali, are not certain, but his work on the Maliki law of inheritance was considered authoritative. Others noted Sicilian jurists are Ibn Yunus, who died in 1059 AD, whose commentary on Al-Mudawwana was considered authoritative, and his disciple Abdul Haq bin Muhammad Quraishi, who performed the pilgrimage twice and is reported to have met Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni. His works include critical commentaries on Sahnun. A Sicilian jurist and theologian noted for his piety and for his scholarship was Atiq bin Ali al-Samantari, who traveled extensively in the Muslim Orient. In Kalam, which means scholastic theology, the Sicilian scholars generally followed the Ash'arite school. Some of the jurists, like Abdul Haq bin Muhammad and Ibn Zafar, were also theologians. Al-Mazari was renowned both as a jurist and as a theologian. His critique of al-Juwayni is steeped in Ash'arite scholasticism. Biographical and hagiographical literature provides information about several pious men and saints in Sicily who abstained from vices, spent days and nights in prayer and penitence, and were generally respected by the populace. Early Sufism in Sicily, as represented by Abu Bakr Muhammad and As-Samantari, was simple and ascetic. Sayyid bin Salam, a Sicilian born in Girgenti, traveled to the Hijaz, where he was held in esteem, and finally went to Iran, where he died at Nishapur in 983 AD. Abul Hasan Ali is said to have been a disciple of the famous mystique Sari Sakati. Atiq bin Muhammad, a Sicilian mystique, migrated to Baghdad, where he won respect. On the other hand, Ibn Hawqal, the geographer, who was very critical of Sicilian Arab manners and customs, was also very critical of the Sufi rabats, that means hospices, in Sicily, which he described as nests of sanctimonious ruffians and slanderers. Others have also criticized the malami, that means blameworthy or blame-seeking, tendencies of Sicilian Sufism, its riotous excesses, and its preoccupation with song and dance. Turning to more secular intellectual activity, one may begin with history. Apart from the so-called Cambridge Chronicle, written in Kilbite, Sicily by a Christian, or the son of a Christian, and forming an important source for the history of Muslim Sicily, little historical writing by the Muslims of Sicily has survived. Haji Khalifa has mentioned a history of Sicily by Abu Zaid al-Ghumari, who was a Berber. A scholar of Sicilian origin, Abdullah, translated Dioscorides' treatise on botany for Abdurrahman III, the Umayyad Caliph of Spain. An astronomer, mathematician, and poet, Abu Abdullah bin al-Qurani, is mentioned by Ibn Qata, who also points out that the famous poet and belletrist Ibn al-Tazi was primarily a medical doctor. Emery has conjectured that, as there were Greeks living side by side with Arabs, the Arabs of Sicily must have paid some attention to Greek philosophy and science, and studied them in the Greek language. Among the Arab physicians in Sicily was Abdus Said bin Ibrahim, whose work on pharmacopoeia has survived. Abu Bakr as-Siqili, who was among the teachers of the famous physician and author Ibn Abi Usaybiyah. Abu Abbas Ahmad bin Abd Salam wrote a commentary on one of Avicenna's medical works. Under Abul Futuh Yusuf, the arts and the sciences flourished in Kilbite, Sicily. The intellectuals of his reign included a bizarre character, Ibn al-Mu'attib, who spent his energy in pursuit of alchemy and in the quest of the philosopher's stone. More distinguished was Muhammad bin Abdun, a panegyrist of the Amir. The culture and gentility of the Kilbite court was known and admired on the Italian mainland. In lexicography and in philological and linguistic studies, Sicily was very much a part of the world of Islam. Sicilian scholars in these fields traveled or migrated abroad, while scholars from other countries made Sicily their home. Thus, a Cordovan grammarian, linguist and poet, Musa bin Asbagh, came to live in Sicily. At the beginning of the 11th century, another distinguished linguist, Said bin Fathun, arrived in Sicily. An eminent Sicilian grammarian, Abu Abdullah Muhammad al-Qahtani, traveled through Iraq, Khurasan, and Ghaznavid, India, and died at Isfahan. An Aghlabid freedman who had settled down in Sicily and won fame as a scholar of the Quran and of Arabic grammar was Muhammad bin Khurasan, whose name suggests a Persian origin. Riyad al-Nufus is the outstanding Sicilian contribution to the Tabaqat literature, giving notices on the life and works of jurists, grammarians, lexicographers, poets, and others. Sayyid bin Hassan, a lexicographer of Baghdad, traveled to Sicily and died there in 995 AD. Tahir bin Muhammad al-Raqabani, a well-known lexicographer of his time, spent the greater part of his life in Sicily. His son Ali was also a lexicographer and knew a great deal of pre-Islamic Arabic poetry by heart. One of the most famous linguists of Sicily was Ibn Rashid, of Greek or Italian ancestry, born at Msila in North Africa, and an immigrant to Sicily, where he died at Mazara. His immigration to Sicily was probably occasioned by the pillaging of the Hilalian Arabs in Ifriqiya. His major work on poetics, the Kitab al-Umda, had already been written in North Africa under the patronage of the Zirid Muiz bin Badis. It is considered one of the finest works on poetic criticism in Arabic. A number of his other works, now lost, were written after his arrival in Sicily. He was also a classical poet of eminence. Dear listeners, support me with Buy Me a Coffee or a Super Thanks. Ibn al-Bir, also known as Abu Bakr Muhammad bin Ali, lexicographer and philologist, was born in Sicily towards the end of the 10th century. He studied in the Orient and at Alexandria at Mahdiya, returning to Sicily towards the end of the Kilbite period. At a later date, he lived for a time at Mazara under the Qaid Ibn Manqud, and there he met Ibn Rashid. Ibn Manqud sent him away because of his addiction to alcohol. He then went to Palermo, where he lived until 1068 AD. He contributed to the survival of the poetic tradition of Al-Mutanabbi and may have been responsible for the transmission of the famous dictionary, As-Sihah of Jauhari. Only partial extracts from the works of Sicilian Arabic poets have survived in anthologies. The most distinguished is Ibn al-Qatta's Turatul Khatira, selections from which, as well as extracts from the works of several other poets of the island, are included in Imad-ad-Din Katib al-Isfahani's great anthology, Kharidat al-Qasr. Other such anthologies include those of Ibn Sa'id al-Maghribi and Ibn Bashrun. At least one of the Aghlabid princes posted in Sicily, Mujbir bin Ibrahim, was a poet. He was the Wali of Messina, one of the Arab territories in southern Italy. Of the Kelbite emirs and princes, quite a few wrote poetry. They included Ahmed bin Hassan, Abdurrahman bin Hassan, Jafar bin Yusuf, and others. Naturally, these and other Kelbites were patrons of poets. So were also some of the Kelbite nobles and officers. These included the jurist Abu Musa Isa bin Abd al-Munaim and his son Muhammad. The secretary Ibn as-Sabagh, a supporter of al-Akal and a friend of Ibn Rashiq, was also a poet. A remarkable Arab poet who lived for nearly half a century at the Kelbite court was Ibn al-Qayyad. Practically nothing is known of his life in Palermo. Some fragments of his verse have been preserved by his friend Ismail at-Tujibi. Some 200 lines of Ibn al-Khayyat's verses have survived and show him as a panegyrist of the Kelbites and an admirer of the Sicilian landscape. Abul Qasim Hashim bin Yunus, who was a writer of epistles, witticisms, and maqamat, was also a poet. Abul Fadl Mushrif bin Rashid, whose 3 panegyrics have survived, was a harmonious and gentle poet who did not lack either vigor of style or loftiness of thought. Ibn at-Tazi, who has been mentioned earlier, was also probably the most eminent satirist of Kelbite Sicily, and is notable in this field for the vivacity of his conceits, his incisive style, and his elegance and grace. Another famous writer of prose and verse was Ibn at-Tubi, also known as Abul Hasan Ali bin Hassan bin at-Tubi, who lived in the first half of the 11th century, travelled through the Orient, and was attached for a time to the court of the Zirid Mu'iz bin Badis in Ifriqiya. Ibn Nasusi, a poet of either Spanish or Maltese origin, made Palermo his home and wrote of Sicily with nostalgia. Dear listeners, support me with Buy Me a Coffee or a Super Thanks. The themes of Sicilian Arabic poetry of the Kelbite era are eulogy, love, wine, and the funerary elegy, or else the praise of palace, lute, lamp, orange, and palm. Most of this poetry has a singular beauty of its own. One does not perceive in it much of the characteristic tone of eroticism prevalent in Arabic poetry in general, but rather a sense of pride in the valor of Arab heroes in Sicily, an exaltation of the heroism of its emirs, and an attitude of human sorrow expressed with rare simplicity. In the tradition of poetry, Arab Sicily naturally gravitated towards North Africa, to which it was politically attached, but Gabrieli has made an interesting point in suggesting elements in direction and style which point to a close affinity between the Arab Spanish and Arab Sicilian poetic traditions. The works of the eminent Spanish Arab poets Ibn Zaydun, Ibn Labana, and Ibn az-Zakak have those very characteristic one finds in the surviving extracts of Sicilian poetry. The same themes, the same heritage of imagination, the same formal refinements, even often the same meter concentrating on the lyrical vision. Sicily was almost a literary province of Spain during the 10th and 11th centuries. The form called Zajl, to which Ibn Quzman owes his fame in Spain, was also written in Sicily and was probably close to the spirit and language of the people. It gives one a clue to the character of the spoken Arabic of the island, which was probably similar to some contemporary North African dialect. End of Chapter 5.